The difference is in a socialist state, the leadership say, if you are poor, here are the tools to do something about it. Here's the land that you need to change that. When they have a nutrition drive and they're like, so I've been studying maternal health. So it's all like, the first 1,000 days, you've got to have good nutrition and everything. And so what do? They make it law that every single person should have access to a land to garden. Like, you can't just tell people, you've got to have more vegetables, it's good for infant nutrition. You've also got to give them the tools to do that. But socialism is about giving you the tools, not Laos socialism anyway. Give you the land, give you the education, the agricultural extension, but don't give you the vegetables, or just give you a piece of paper telling you should eat more vegetables, but know where to buy them and no money to buy them with.
Welcome to Actually Existing Socialism. I'm your host, Tony. It's great to be back after a decently long hiatus, as well as time working on my other podcast, Proles Pod. That said, thank you all so much for your support. Whether you're a Patreon subscriber or just a casual listener, thank you for making this project something which will be continuing on. Today's episode features the return of anthropologist Holly Hai to discuss her latest work on Laos, officially known as the Lao People's Democratic Republic. Holly previously joined the show for a two-part series with episodes titled Lao, the Revolutionary Origins of the Forgotten Socialist Country, and Laos, Socialist Democracy and Culture. While you don't need to have heard those episodes to enjoy this one, I highly recommend going back to them after listening, as they provide great context for today's conversation. This time we're discussing Holly's new substack project, Laos, Revolutions and Reproduction, which you can find linked in the show notes or at revolutionsandreproduction.substack.com. As mentioned in our discussion, Holly's intent of this project is to be interactive, so make sure you sign up for the Substack, read its enlightening posts, and reach out to her with your commentary and questions. Holly's been conducting fieldwork in Laos for over 2 decades. She uses ethnographic and anthropological methods to explore how everyday people experience socialism, development, policy, religion, and more. She studied at the Australian National University and has held postdoctoral fellowships at Yale and Cambridge. You can find more writing at hollyhigh.net, also linked in the show notes. As always, more information related to our discussion is available at patreon.com/AESthepodcast. This show is entirely listener funded, so if you'd like to support the work, Patreon subscribers get access to bonus episodes, including an additional spicy conversation I had with Holly about Laos today. So please do support the show on the Patreon if you're able to. Well, on that note, I'd like to take a second to shout out to our most recent patrons, who are Alex M, Tramutu Chen, Kyle, Matam M, RMND, Hans S, Lexi, Henry N, Mikey M, Melanie M, Bearstock, Jules D, Vivek B, Elon Peach, Seamus K, Matt C, Jason P, Mona L, The Communist Larry David, Thomas S, Old Left, Alex, Annette Carpian, Miles, Victoria Helm. Thank you for your support. The continuing of the show would literally not be possible without the support of Patreons like them, so thank you truly. If you're not in a position to contribute in that way, you can still support the show by sharing it with friends, family, and comrades, by following us on Twitter and Instagram at AESthepodcast, by subscribing and leaving a review on your favorite podcast app. If you've already done any of these, thank you. These podcasts are made to be listened to and shared. Most importantly, support your local worker struggles, however you can. Enjoy the episode. I'm incredibly excited to welcome back to the show Holly Hai.
Hello everyone. Hi Tony. It's great to be back.
It is very great to have you back on the show, Holly. For listeners who do not know, Holly was actually one of the early guests on Actually Existing Socialism, and we did a long and much needed dive into both the early revolutionary history of Laos, her anthropological research on the ethnic Gantu people, and socialist democracy in Laos today. Holly, you may not know this, but people truly love those episodes, particularly my friend Ray, who's a co-host with me actually on my other podcast, Proles Pod, or the podcast formerly known as Proles the Roundtable. And according to her, she's actually responsible for at least half of the thousands and thousands of downloads because she shares it so often. High praise indeed. I recommend our listeners check out those episodes after listening to this one, or re-listening to them if you've already listened to them before. Because Laos needs really socialists in the West, needs solidarity from us. It needs us to learn about its culture, its material conditions, its people, and its revolutionary history. Any thoughts on that, Holly, on the reception of those episodes?
I actually had no idea that it had been listened to so many times. But yeah, that's fantastic. And all I would add is I think what drives me is also that I think we need to learn from Laos as well. So often the mindset that people bring to looking at poorer countries or countries led by people of color is, oh, look, we can look at them and we can see how people lived in the past. But I think Laos, like everywhere, shows us the seeds of what the futures will look like.
A few months ago, you launched a fascinating project on Substack called Revolutions in Reproduction. Can you walk us through the inspiration behind it? What prompted you to start? And what are you hoping to explore through it?
Because you've read my book, Project Land, and thank you so much for reading it, you'll know that I arrived in this village, New Gandon, expecting to study sort of ethnic minorities in Laos and their relationship with the state. And what I found is people who wanted to tell me the story about the revolution and their role in it and their kind of socialism and how they felt that they were a living example of how it could be done. And I listened to them and I challenged myself to learn, maybe to leave behind some of my preconceptions about what socialism has to be in order to be real socialism, and to learn from them about what they were actually doing on the ground. A recurring theme in that book is, what about the women? As you know, some of the chapters can be quite sad about maybe women still, it's an ethnic minority village where they used to practice, say, debt marriage, arranged marriages, marriages of children, multiple wives with one husband. All of this sort of thing is now illegal under the Lao People's Democratic Republic family laws, but the legacies of this and the practices still continue. So a lot of the book is about this sort of tension between cultural practices and the drive to become a socialist model village. So this often left women in very sad and difficult situations. I recorded domestic violence, and I guess part of my coming around to sympathy with the socialist project in Laos was looking at the plight of women. I realized that my own reactions to seeing what I saw in the village were not that different from government workers who came with their okay, we're gonna have a revolution now. We're going to change all of this and we're going to live in a better, brighter future. I guess seeing, say, domestic violence and seeing women in marriages they didn't want to be in was one of the inspirations for me, having another look at the Laos Socialist Project in a less cynical way and realizing that there was actually a lot of common ground between me and what the Laos state was trying to achieve. I was thinking about this afterwards and I was thinking, well, what is the role for women and families and marriage and all of that sort of thing in the Laos Socialist Project? And I came back to Australia and did some reading and thinking about that. And I realized that socialist projects around the world have had a lot of different approaches to women and the family and reproduction. Obviously, the early days of the Soviet Union, there were a lot of groundbreaking, pioneering policies liberating women. It was the first country in the world to legalize abortion. They loosened up laws on divorce. But then under Stalin, this kind of went in a different direction with women being encouraged to have as many babies as possible, and they banned abortion again. And then over in Eastern Europe, you've got examples of architecture that was based on breaking down the private family home and having more communal areas, like communal cooking areas. Whereas in Laos, the family and the household still seems to be a very strong social unit. So I guess I had a research question about, okay, if I'm going to take Laos socialism seriously and really investigate it as a live example of an attempt to create a socialist state, what is their relationship to reproduction? Where does reproduction fit here? So I launched a project on pregnancy, birth, and parenting in Laos. And I got funding from the Australian Research Council for that. It was a 4-year project, which is just coming to an end now. And with a team, Lao researchers and an Australian PhD student in partnership with the University of Health Sciences in Vientiane, we collected ethnographic observations and did interviews in a number of villages in Laos. And also my PhD student was studying the training of public health officers, sort of looking at the kind of values they're trying to pursue around mother and child health in Laos. So coming towards the end of the project, I started to look at as a whole, both in Laos over time and in different places, and also across different socialist projects around the world. I sort of take the socialist experiments as real life examples of actually existing very left politics. And I think left politics in general has a problem with reproduction. There is not one way this has been dealt with in all of these different examples. Even in Laos, they've tried a number of different things. And what I think this shows is that if we're going to move left politics forward, we need to tackle head on the question of reproduction. Because it seems to me the political right has no problem at all with reproduction. They love it. They're like the family, women are there, they're having their babies, as many as possible. But left-leaning politics, I think, has this really troubled relationship with reproduction. And I think if we can sort of keep getting at that and looking at it head on, looking at what's happening on the ground, and also thinking in sort of idealistic utopian ideas about what would be really great, we can get some progress. My Substack is about looking at how reproduction has been handled on the ground in Laos, but it's also a very personal project about, I'm a mother of 2 children, so I bring a lot of that in. And also the broader anthropology of reproduction, thinking about how we can bring that to bear on the idea of what a really revolutionary approach to reproduction would look like.
No, that was an excellent, very brief exploration of, the reality that I think sometimes people will try to, in the West particularly, flatten socialism and what it could be. Socialism is like this kind of one thing rather than the multitude of experiments that happen in just one socialist country in one decade, in one specific time, in one project, right? I actually recall reading one of your posts from your website. It's called Our Culture Sees... It's at hollyhigh.net. It's called Our Culture Sees Women's Bodies as Faulty Machines. There are other birthing possibilities. It was interesting because I was reading this as my wife was pregnant with our second child. So there's a lot of insight. We talked about it. So again, recommend people check out our website and the project of the Substack. Your first series of posts tackles one of the most, I would say, kind of hot button issues in North America today, which is our housing crisis, shortages, affordability, questions of ownership and how plausible or possible that even is. Given that capitalism is often framed as the champion of home ownership, what are some of the misconceptions surrounding this contradiction, especially when socialist mass housing is concerned?
So we have a similar situation here in Australia. We have a housing crisis and become quite a political hot topic. In the last election, there was a lot of talk about it. And it seems to me that here, left politics, when they think about, what would a left politics of the home look like? And with home ownership, it would be that there would be lots of mass government funded, so what they call social housing. And this is often inspired by the example of the post-war UK example, where they built a lot of social housing. And they call, in the literature, they even call this the socialistic style approach to housing, and with this sort of cradle to the grave social contract that the state would care for you with homes, with healthcare, with education, and you in response would pay tax and maybe serve in the military and be a good citizen. And this sort of all collapsed, but is quite nostalgically, I guess, by a lot of academics. England is like a small island off the coast of Europe, but it has an outsized influence in the English-speaking world on thinking about housing possibilities. So I wanted to introduce the perspective from Laos to try and get us out of the sort of box of always thinking in the same old examples. And I was sort of cheekily wanted to say, well, you think that's socialistic, but let's look at a real socialist country and see how they handle housing. And it just so happens that Laos, by some accounts, has the highest rates of home ownership in the world. The top 10 keep juggling around between each other. But if you look at the top 10, in general, all of them are either socialist countries or very recently post-socialist. So Vietnam's usually there, China's usually there. The latest rates that were recorded for Laos, and this will probably change because they're doing a census this year, but the last time they did a census, which was 2017, they found that 95.9% of people responded that they were living in an individually owned home. So this is often rounded up to 96%. This is the statistic you'll see thrown around of home ownership rates in Laos. So it's not that 96% of people own homes, it's that 96% of houses, of the housing stock, is owned privately.
That's a good distinction, thank you.
Yeah, it's owned and it's owner occupied. It's not rented out. The rates for renting were like 2%. And the rates for living in an institution like a boarding house or a prison or something were minuscule. Most people are living in a home that is owned by the owner and they're not paying rent. They're living in family groups. Most people live in family groups. The average home size is 5 to 6 people. So basically, I argue in these posts that there's this concept in Laos, like a policy push that's been going on since the turn away from collectivized agriculture. There was a new emphasis put instead on the family economy. This is when the family was recognized as a basic economic unit that was going to be encouraged under Lao forms of socialism. But it's also backed up by the land law. So I think it's the 2015 land law, again, emphasizes that all land belongs to the state, is owned collectively. So people don't have ownership of land, they have rights to use land. So this empowers the state authorities to redistribute land, including residential land. And this is done primarily, in most cases, through the powers that very local administrative bodies like the village administration have to redistribute land. But in my post, I point out that most homelessness, if it arises, like if, say, a young couple want to move out of home and start their own house, mostly this kind of stuff is dealt with at the household level. So homes, the family is both in policy and in practice a very important element of how issues around housing are dealt with.
So, Holly, I'm confused because from my understanding, or rather maybe a popular understanding, underneath socialism or socialist country, people don't even own their toothbrushes, right?
Right. So I'm just a student of socialism as well. So like if any listeners know more about this, I would really appreciate you to reach out and tell me. So I think in the Lao Revolution, originally they believed that they could leapfrog over capitalism and proceed directly to socialism. And they tried this. They never, with production, with like collectivized rice production, for like 2 or 3 rice seasons. They had a terrible flood in one year and then tried collectivization, but they quickly turned away from it. This was I'm looking very deeply at the year 1979 at the moment, because up till then, the phrase proceed directly to socialism without passing by capitalism was very common. And I understand that this is like a analysis of the economy. And once you have the analysis of the economy, then you can build the appropriate policy. That's the kind of approach that they had, is like once you define the economic base, you can decide the appropriate policy. But then they decided, after the collectivization didn't turn good results, and also they were getting these inspirations from Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, they decided they took this turn to the family economy. And around the same time, there was something called, I think, the agricultural policy in the Soviet Union, where they had this big food drive to increase food production. And they did, again, an analysis of the actual economy and discovered that like something like 70% of potatoes in the Soviet Union were being produced on private lots, even though these only were like a minuscule proportion of the actual agricultural land. So they realized that these private plots were actually very productive for certain forms of production, not for like wheat or something. They still did that on collectivized farms, but for things like milk and dairy and eggs, which they wanted to increase so that they could meet the nutritional guidelines of the Soviet Union. They realized that the most productive way to make these was on private plots. So they started to increase the amount of private plots. Again, like if any listeners out there have examples of what was going on in the Soviet Union in this sort of early 80s period, I'll be really interested, because so much of the Soviet Union literature is either on the very early exciting period or the end of the Soviet Union. But that period in the early 1980s, they were still experimenting with different ways to have a socialist country. But the only way I can really read this is kind of through these things that were published at the time, when people writing in English, I don't read Russian, people who are writing in English still believe that the Soviet Union was a going concern and they were worried about it. So like the CIA and stuff is reporting on their turn to private plot use and this sort of thing. But I don't know of any academic historians who have really gone into this period. It's a fascinating time. So Laos also took this turn to the family economy. So even state workers were encouraged to have a private plot at home where they grew vegetables and to sell these, to raise their own chickens. People talk about in those days even going to meetings. Say you worked even in the city and you worked for the government and you go to a meeting. Women would take like embroidery to do, because they wear these skirts called sin in Laos, and they have a sort of a long skirt with embroidery on the bottom. So women would sit there stitching these things to wear or to sell. It was not only tolerated. It was sort of part of the aesthetic, was that to be a good socialist citizen, you had a lot of motivation to get up and look after your own needs and to find opportunities to make sure that your family was fed and that you had something to sell and you had a bit of money in your pocket. And this aesthetic of what it is to be a good socialist is still there in Laos. I went in January to the caves where the socialists had their headquarters during the American bombing. It's called Vieng Sai. I would definitely recommend, if any of your listeners are heading over to Laos, make sure you go to Vieng Sai. There's a wonderful museum there now with an audio tour in English, and you ride bikes around the base. Make sure you have a few days there to really get the most out of it. And the people who live there are obviously quite passionate about the revolution and what happened. You can still see, like, on the roadside, instead of grass growing by the curb, everyone's got vegetable plots. So everybody grows something. And yeah, this is definitely part of what it is to be a good socialist. So this idea we have in the West that everything is centralized and everything is run by this big sort of big brother government who doesn't give you any rights and you don't have any freedom to do anything. It couldn't be further from what I see in Laos. I say in my Substack post, the way it's unfolded in Laos is that the role of the central government is to, as they say, is to be the leader. And what comes out of this leadership level is this relentless encouragement for people to self-organize locally to make sure their own needs are met. Okay, you need a skirt? Okay, get a needle. You need some vegetables. You have the right to this piece of land to grow some. You need a house? Okay, that piece of land belongs to you. Build one. And I've been writing about this for decades. At first, I didn't realize it was socialism. I was like, on what basis are they like all going to each other's place and building each other's houses? Like, is this some beautiful tradition, or is this like some kind of corvée labor? But I've realized that, it's both. Obviously, a lot of the population of the world can trace back in some form or another a tradition of peasant lifestyles. Whether your ancestors come from Scotland or from different parts of Africa, or they come from Southeast Asia or China or Europe, the model of the peasant village and the peasant household is extremely widespread in the world. I should include the Americas in there. And so, if you want to talk about traditions, that gets pretty vague pretty quickly. But I think the point is that in Laos, the central level has relentlessly encouraged people to understand that they are members of a social unit. So the most basic unit being the family, and the next level up being the village, and the next level up after that being the district. But at the district, it starts getting less immediate. But the household and the village are these very immediate units that everyone belongs to one. Even if you live in the city, I have to emphasize the cities are broken down into villages, and these villages are expected to cooperate to solve local problems locally, such as maintaining the village school, maintaining cleanliness, basic sanitation. All of this sort of thing is organized at the village level. When I first went to Laos, I attended a lot of meetings, village level meetings, and I sort of thought people were wasting their time, I guess. They spent a lot of time fulfilling obligations to be these various roles in the village, like the local health volunteer, or like the first, second and third village chief, the local head of the women's union, the local head of the youth union. There was a lot of cynicism amongst Lao people as well about what the hell this was all for. But over time, I've seen that what it builds up is a sort of intuitive, knee-jerk understanding of who your people are, who is your local, who are your most immediate people around you who you can coordinate with if you need to.
I feel like if there's one stereotype about socialism in the West that is correct, is the meetings thing. is there are a lot of meetings.
And also the a stiltedness of the language that's used in those meetings. Like it's not like free flowing. Can I tell I don't know if this is a funny story or tragic, but I want to share a story about my PhD student. She was asked to give a PowerPoint presentation at the end of her research, which she did. And she used PowerPoint. Like these days you can have like different designs and you can have photographs and you can have animations and stuff in PowerPoint. So she did all that. And at the end, they said, no, that wasn't appropriate. And she was like, why? And they had lots of feedback for her. But one of the things was that her PowerPoint was too colorful. They wanted it more boring. They the aesthetic is very...
That's so interesting.
Some of the cliches are not wrong, yeah.
And I guess some of the ones that are wrong that I think you kind of highlighted were the question of ownership. capitalism is presented as the system in which you get to own your things, and as the owner, no one has a right to really impact that. But as we kind of see today is that use home ownership rates as an example. The US and Canada, they're sitting in the 60s, 60th percentile of home ownership rates, which is very vastly different from most socialist or post-socialist countries, which are all, I'd say, probably 85% and higher, right? And so I think that's a very key thing to understand when comparing or trying to contrast these systems. And even like a secondary thing is this sense of either there being a nanny state, this idea that the government is going to do everything for you, and that's what it's trying to do. They'll have someone who's going to move this to that over there, rather than you, as you said, kind of taking hold onto the initiative. There's a sense, I would say this is probably mostly North American thing, where it's like socialism is meant to appeal to lazy people for whatever reason. I've never quite understood it, but in the West, socialism, or in North America, socialism is for people who don't want to work. But then in socialist countries, you probably end up doing more work that you want to do than in other places. So it's an interesting kind of contradiction there too.
Lao people are extremely hardworking, and that ethic is definitely promoted by the central level as part of their leadership. Is like, if you are poor, then it's not just like you go out and work. The difference is, in a socialist state, the leadership say, if you are poor, here are the tools to do something about it. Here's the land that you need to change that. When they have a nutrition drive and they're like, so I've been studying maternal health. So it's all like, the first 1,000 days, you've got to have good nutrition and everything. And so what do? They make it law that every single person should have access to a land to garden. Like, you can't just tell people, you've got to have more vegetables, it's good for infant nutrition. You've also got to give them the tools to do that. But socialism is about giving you the tools, not like, Lao socialism anyway, give you the land, give you the education, the agricultural extension, but don't give you the vegetables, or just give you a piece of paper telling you should eat more vegetables, but know where to buy them and no money to buy them with.
You've pointed out that, large-scale housing initiatives often have deeper roots in socialist systems. Lao, as you've already kind of explained for us, very high home ownership rates. But I was wondering, how does that actually work in practice, right? Because, like, say, for example, in Canada, if you want to buy a house, you're going to get a mortgage to do that. Like, how does one acquire a house? So why are the rates so high, I guess, is my question. What's the mechanism for that?
I think we're going to have to go right back and talk about citizenship first, because citizenship lays out who has rights to land. And then once people have lands, then I'll talk about how they build houses. So to be a citizen in Laos, you have to be a member of a family. Everyone in Laos is registered as part of a household census book. Most people use this as their only form of ID. You can have an identification card or a driver's license as well, but the most basic form of ID is this book that has all the members of the household and it's sort of certified by the village chief. It has a photograph and this sort of thing. And so if somebody gets married and goes to live in a different house, they'll change which household registration book they're entered into. People are not citizens of the country as sort of free agents. They're citizens insofar as they are part of a social unit. And this is a household which is part of a village. Okay, so within that household, by law, people have obligations to one another. Parents are obliged to look after people who are under 18 in their household, and children are obliged to look after their parents when they can no longer work. And the retirement age is, I think, 60 for men and 55 for women or something. Legally, people are obliged to look after their own families. So usually what happens, it's possible to buy land in Laos if you're a citizen. Foreigners are not allowed to own land in Laos. If you're a citizen, you can have use rights over land. And so when people sell land, what they're often selling is the right to use the land. This is demonstrated by the fact that this person has paid tax on it. So once you have use rights in land, you pay land tax. And then when you go to sell the land, you sell your land tax receipts and the right to pay tax on it. So you will, like when you drive around Laos, you will see signs saying for sale and stuff. But what they're actually selling is the right to use land, not the actual land itself. where I work out in the countryside, it's not at all common for land to be sold. And I talk in my Substack about my ridiculous attempt at one point to buy some land. Not myself, I was going to give the money to my Lao family and get them to buy it just because I wanted this dilapidated, ruined house to be demolished. And it looks, because I was worried it had mosquitoes all through it and everything. And I was like, oh, can we just buy it and grow bananas there? And my Lao family were like, oh, no way, no one would ever sell land here. And I was like, come on, let's just try. But sure enough, we were unable to buy this plot of land because I talk about how there's a moral economy of land where it's understood as extremely valuable, but for that, and a real asset, but for that very reason, it's sort of above commodification, or there's no price you can put on it. There isn't a price because it's so valuable. So I talk about a land transaction where a lot of rice fields were transferred from one family to another as a gift. And I talk about that as quite rational. It wasn't just about making social relationships. It was also about the nature of rice production and the nature of family-based economy. When you have a family economy, often, Alexander Chayanov, who was a Soviet or early Russian analyst of peasant economies and household economies. He argued that it's not a supply and demand curve, determining price when you have a household economy and you're talking about household labor as the people who will do the work in order to meet household needs. He said often the trade-off is between drudgery and the benefit that could come from that drudgery. So you sort of what he was saying is you kind of reach a point in the household where the extra labor of doing those extra rice fields just isn't worth the yield that you could get from it, because households try to even out their labor over a year. Whereas if you have just one kind of thing, like a lot of rice fields, that's a lot of labor at a couple of times a year. But your household labor would be better distributed over a number of different activities over the years. So anyway, this household transferred these rice fields, and I sort of use that as an example for talking about how land can be both extremely valuable and also impossible to commodify because it doesn't conform to, say, supply-demand determinants of price. This is a long way of saying, how do people get hold of land? Number one way to get hold of land is through your family. Your family will gift you a plot of land. So in the particular village that I know best, they're matrifocal. So you get clusters of sisters growing up together. And then as they get married, the mother will give some of her land, her residential land, to her daughter. And so you'll get this sort of little clusters of households living next to each other on residential land that's pretty close to each other. And they'll be, grown-up sisters from the same mother who all, got a parcel of land from mum and now have built a house. And whereas sons tend to go off and live with their wives. So that's how they access land, is through their wife's mother's gifts. So that's the number one way. Now, if there's a problem of homelessness that can't be solved by the family, then it goes up to the next level of administration, which is the village. So under Lao law, villages empowered to quite a remarkable degree to solve problems like this locally. So they are empowered, because all land belongs to the state, they're empowered to just take some land. If it's not being used, if they can show it's not used, they're empowered to take some land and redistribute it to people who need it. So I have seen examples of that. An example would be the village I wrote about, Gandon. They resettled and they needed land in the lowlands area. So that was redistributed to them. They didn't have to pay for it. They were simply given residential land. So most people obtain residential land for free out especially in the rural and remote areas. So then the question is, how do they build the house? Like, most people's costs in owning a home are construction costs. So there are private banks in Laos. You can get a home loan if you qualify. But the reality is that most people are nowhere near qualifying. And so people save for a lot of years. Maybe they go and work in Thailand and get a little nest egg together, and then they buy construction materials, sometimes over a long period. Some people borrow from family and friends. I've even seen people borrow from their employers, advance some salary so that they could buy housing materials. And then the labor is very often done by family and village networks, and people hold a party afterwards, to offer food and that sort of thing. And so there's this sort of reciprocal labor in building homes, and people are extremely skilled in construction. I'm always amazed by how many people know so much about building safe and efficient homes.
Oh, that's so interesting. Yeah, that is a very different housing system than, say, for example, what we have in Canada today. Just want to make sure I'm understanding this correctly. After the revolution, land gets redistributed in a variety of different ways to different people. And it's the rights to use that land rather than like them like owning it, I guess. And so then as form of an inheritance, you could say, it gets passed down and parceled out to children or descendants of a person. And then that kind of keeps on going on. And that is why the home ownership rate is high. Is that a very oversimplified summary? Or
I'll put it like this. I mean, the Lao case is
it's a bit more complex.
Every case is unique.
Yeah.
But the Lao case is that Laos had quite a low population density at the point of the revolution because of depopulation by Thailand, by Siam. In the previous century, they had deported a lot of Lao people across the Mekong River to settle northeast Thailand. So that's why you'll actually find today that there are more people who are Lao and speak Lao in Thailand than in Laos. So they were forcibly removed. Like some of the families I know who live in Vientiane, their family story, the capital city of Vientiane, their family story is that, their family came from the north and there were very rich rice fields in Vientiane and they just found all these abandoned rice fields and they started farming there and the family's still there, 100 years later. So when the revolution came, there was not the promise or the need or the platform to redistribute land because most people in Laos were scattered smallholders already living on their own land in their own houses. There were some people who had been displaced by the war, obviously, and especially those big battlefields like where Gandon is. That was a big battlefield during the war. A lot of villages had, they'd become refugees and left their land. And so there was a bit of question about people shuffling around after the war because of the devastation of the war itself. But in terms of introducing a huge land reform push, that didn't have to happen because you didn't find these big land owners with lots of landless people around them. It wasn't like in China or Vietnam. The situation in Laos was more like, how do we not ruin this? How do we not dispossess people of their land, but still deliver them the economic transformations they desire? People wanted education, they wanted healthcare, they wanted more modern conveniences. But how do you do that without ending up with a lot of landless people?
Some of that history you mentioned, particularly about, Siam, Thailand, and the movements of people during that period, we actually cover that in the first episode we did together. You do give us a kind of a sweeping history of those few hundred years. That was very interesting. So say, for example, let's use the example of you're a young person in Laos, you're in your 20s. The most likely way you're going to acquire that house is from getting married or moving into another household economy, essentially.
Yeah, or the most likely way is that your parents will give you some land and you will build a house, or you will inherit your parents' house. So because children are legally required to care for their parents in their old age, you get a lot of younger people in their 20s living with their parents because of their caring duties.
Oh yeah, it's very different. So you just mentioned this. One intriguing element of Lao culture is this matrifocal structure or lens or way of life, where homes and family life often revolve around women. How does this, can you give us maybe an example of how that dynamic impacts everyday life? And is this matrifocal focus a product of socialism, or is it a parallel cultural tradition that intersects with it?
So Laos is a very ethnically diverse country, and about half the population are ethnic Lao. So I did my first field work with the ethnic Lao, and I write about how it's taken me a long time to realize that they are matriarchal, because the reason it took me a long time is because when I first did anthropology, when I was first trained, this word was treated with a lot of contempt. I was taught at undergraduate level that there were no examples of matriarchal societies. And whenever we found an example of a society where women were quite empowered and ownership was traced through women and this sort of thing, there was always some reason why this was taken as not a serious example. So one of my posts on Substack is why this word matriarchy was suppressed in anthropology and kind of the absurdity of the history of that debate. And I actually link it to Cold War ideologies and what an impact they had on academic thought and even anthropological debates about kinship. It went that deep, the animosities of the Cold War. So it's taken me a long time to be brave enough to say matriarchal, but here I am saying it on a podcast. Yes, the ethnic Lao, I would say, are matriarchal. And by that, I don't mean women are like violent to their husbands and there's heaps of domestic violence, but it's the women doing it to the men or something. It's not like that. What I mean is they're matriarchal in the sense that inheritance goes through the female line and that families are based around a woman at the center. For a long time, I called this matricentric, but now I just think it's just plain old matriarchal. So what do I see in that kind of social arrangement? Well, I'm in the privileged position of actually being able to just drive a few 100 kilometers and look at a patriarchal example as well. The ethnic Gundu are patriarchal in their family relationships and in their inheritance practices. I was able to do fieldwork in 2 different settings. And so I thought quite a lot about how much the different family structures influenced everyday life. And I came away feeling that the matriarchal arrangement really, even though it's mainly about property and family relationships, it really does benefit women a lot materially, because I found that women had a lot of support structures around them because women, when they marry, tend to live near their own mothers, either in the same house or close by. When women go to have babies, for instance, or get married, their family's right there looking after them. So when I was doing this birth project, a lot of women were giving birth in the same house where they themselves were born, and that sense of continuity. Even women who were working in Thailand and got pregnant and they could give birth in hospital in Thailand if they wanted to, instead came back to this village because they wanted to be close to their mothers during that sort of vulnerable time. And, in the postpartum period, they're in their mother's home and they don't work. They're sort of, people cook for them and stuff. So they're really supported. And I really, so I never saw a case of domestic violence in that matriarchal village. I'm not saying that it doesn't happen, but there was no social license for it. But when you see surveys in Laos around domestic violence, because it does happen, the rates of domestic violence in Laos are lower than they are in Australia, but it does happen. But if you look at the survey results of they do surveys of asking people to whether or not they agree with statements like, is it okay to hit your wife if she burns the rice, for instance? So they're trying to identify the social license for domestic violence. And you can see it's completely unevenly distributed between, in the north where you have the more patrilineal societies, you get a lot more agreement with statements like that. Whereas in the ethnic Lao areas and the sort of what I've been calling matriarchal areas, there's almost no agreement for statements like that. There's no social license for domestic violence. So yeah, it's been really interesting. That's one of the reasons I love studying Laos, and I feel such a great sense of sadness about what happened with the war and the bombing, because from an ethnographic perspective about what we could learn about cultural diversity, Laos is just one of those really special places, a little bit like Papua New Guinea or the Amazon, where you have all of these different ethnicities living relatively close to each other, but in amazingly different ways. So it's like being able to walk through this living laboratory of different ways people could possibly live. And unfortunately, that ethnographic work was not done because of the war. So
I would say that I think my favorite article on your Substack currently is the M word in anthropology, which is the one in which you do trace kind of this winding history of the use of the term matriarchy in the past and the present. I found that the one perhaps because I knew the term matriarchy. I'm aware of what it means, but in terms of how it's been used in the anthropological field, I was totally unaware of. So I really enjoyed that one. I recommend people check that one out too.
Oh, thank you.
So it sounds like it's a long-standing ethnic Lao cultural feature to be matriarchal. How does that clash or interact with the socialist tradition in Lao today? Are they seen as stemming from the same place or opposed? Or
matriarchy in Laos, I think, has very deep roots, and that these have been challenged by successive waves of international influence, whether it be influence from the north, from China or from Vietnam or from the Indic influences. A lot of scholars trace the sort of form of statecraft you have in Laos and in Southeast Asia generally, to influences from India. Of course, you have Buddhism coming over the top, and Buddhism is, as it's practiced in Laos, is not particularly kind to women. Can't have to be reincarnated as a man before you can reach enlightenment and that kind of thing. So there are these influences on top which have undermined matriarchy, but I guess the sort of the usual and the analysis that I cite, which is by Matriarchy, is that she's a historian of Laos, is that this matriarchy is a deep underlying cultural logic which keeps popping up by these overlaying influences which have been a lot more oppressive to women. So your question was about how Laos socialism relates to this heritage of matriarchy. So Laos socialism is a quite interesting amalgam of different influences. Obviously, through Vietnam, you've got the original sort of revolutionaries, I guess, were trained in Vietnam and picked up a lot of Vietnamese ideas influenced by Ho Chi Minh. So they had ideas about women's liberation, I guess, but they weren't particularly Lao at the time. And then they had to unify with ethnic minorities, right? Because a lot of the war was fought in the east and the north, so not in ethnic Lao homelands, but up in the mountains with these completely different ethnicities. So I guess, and then after the revolution, it came down into the valleys and the ethnic Lao areas. And since then, there's been just the ethnic Lao was such the culturally dominant force in the country that they have also influenced Lao socialism. So there's been lots of sort of cultural threads and compromises in creating a Lao form of socialism. The question of, are we coming back to the question of how the status of women under all of this? I think they have consistently said that the liberation of women is one of the key tenets of what they're going to deliver, but constantly they had to compromise with what was happening on the ground. You can't walk into an ethnic minority village and say, hey, you village chief, join our movement, and you're not allowed to decide who your daughter marries anymore. They're not going to join your revolution if you do that. Yeah, so there's been like these compromises culturally along the whole way. The Lao Socialist Project has always been a huge project of cultural compromise, and that includes encountering Lao strands of matriarchy. And again, the question to me seems to be, how do we just not ruin this? The few scholars who do work on matriarchy in Laos who have taken this seriously tend to point out that as you get more economic opportunities, as you get more international investment and all of this sort of thing, there is a high chance that you will undermine matriarchal structures. For instance, a lot of land ownership hasn't been documented, but when international aid agencies started coming to Laos and saying, "Oh, we've got to issue land certificates to everyone," often they'd issue them in both couples' names, or even the husband's name, even in villages that were traditionally matriarchal and land belonged to women. So women are kind of dispossessed. If these projects come in without an understanding of what's actually going on the ground, women can very easily get dispossessed.
So it seems like there's a tension that exists there between a tension that I guess always exists in a country that's undergoing some kind of socialist transformation, is dealing with the old stuff. But in this case, it's the new stuff as well, in terms of like the aid agencies kind of imposing, whether it's a conscious or unconscious patriarchal system of organizing, I guess, in the case of the land. What are some of the biggest misconceptions that you see in Western media about Laos, especially in relation to its political system and just everyday life, that you find the most frustrating?
Okay, I've got an answer for this. Is the word authoritarian.
Okay. Let's go there.
What does this word even mean? Yeah, so obviously when I first went to Laos, it was very common to see Laos categorized as an authoritarian one-party state, like how it was classified. And I guess I just had this basic understanding that authoritarian means people can't make their own decisions, or they're not allowed to do anything, they don't have any freedom, whatever this is called. But then when I actually started watching what people do on the ground in Laos, they have way more freedom than we have in Australia. For instance, okay, I live on a property here in Australia. It's got free land, right? And I know people who don't own a house. Am I empowered to give some of that land to my landless friends? No way. No way. But in Laos, absolutely, in fact, moral obligation to do so. So who are we calling authoritarian? Like on a local level, I think the form of governance in Australia is way more authoritarian than in Laos, unless I'm misunderstanding something about this meaning of the word authoritarian. So I decided to look into where this word comes from, and it really flares up in the post-war period in the kind of philosophy that was coming out of sort of European political philosophers who wanted to talk about fallout from fascism and the fight against fascism, but also wanted to condemn the Soviet Union, and found themselves in this sticky position because the Soviet Union had basically won the war against fascism, but they didn't want to endorse the Soviet Union. So they came up with this word authoritarian, where they can condemn the Soviet Union and fascism at the same time.
Interestingly enough, also not condemn the colonial enterprises at the same time, which totally were definitely not authoritarian in their sense.
That's a weird word. And yeah, people still use it to describe Laos. And I'm just like, it just shows the depths of the ignorance about, first of all, what actually happens in Laos and how much freedom people really have to solve. The freedom people have in Laos is to solve their own problems locally. And I feel that's a freedom that's been really taken away in a place like Australia. Like, we just are not empowered to solve problems ourselves. We have to go begging to the state or whatever to change the regulations so that we can do stuff here. But in Laos, people are really empowered to make their own laws locally in terms of how things like, say, water supply, sanitation, homelessness, how these are dealt with locally. That would be my number one thing that annoys me, is the word authoritarian. Oh, the other thing, sorry, I've got another one, legitimacy. This one comes along with authoritarian. So apparently, I didn't know this, I'll tell you at the end, but somebody finally explained to me why you see the word legitimacy used around Laos so often. But I'll give you some examples. Like in academic work, you'll often see people writing, say, a chapter saying, development projects in Laos. These are a claim to legitimacy by the Lao regime. Or you'll see, like the aim for universal healthcare in Laos. So like a lot of healthcare in Laos is free, such as mother and child healthcare. And then they have a goal to make it free for everyone. This is called universal healthcare. And so this sounds great, right? But when people write about this in English, they say, oh, the Lao regime is making a claim for legitimacy by providing free healthcare. I'm just like, why are they using this word? It makes it sound so nefarious, like all of these wonderful projects to provide free stuff to poor people. They're just like, oh, it's a claim to legitimacy. And finally, someone explained it to me. They said in political science, which is an extremely right-wing discipline, they say, if you don't have multi-party democracies, then by definition, you're authoritarian. And if you are authoritarian, by definition, there's a problem in legitimacy. Like how do you legitimate authoritarian rule over people's lives? And so then everything the state does, whether it's building a nice new road or building a school, providing free healthcare, all of these get viewed through the lens of legitimacy. And it makes everything look spooky and weird and crazy. Anyway, I'm just so sick of it. If I see that word legitimacy, I just flinch, because I said to my friend, it's similar to saying, okay, you're an academic, and so you try to do really good, like your best work. You try to identify the truth and communicate it clearly. And so someone could come up to you and say, oh, that's just a claim to legitimacy. You just want to be seen as the legitimate academic. And that might be true. But the core thing is that you're driven by your values to pursue the best work you can possibly do. And it seems to be, if you want to understand what an academic's doing, you have to understand that value. In the same way, when you look at the Lao state, you can go up to them and say, oh, you're just trying to claim legitimacy by doing all of this awesome stuff. But that won't get you anywhere in understanding what the political project is. To understand the political project, you have to understand that these people have values that are driving them. And what are the values? What are the values driving this political project? You can't just say everything is a claim to legitimacy. It's such a hollow way of understanding anything, because you can apply it to everything.
Yeah. No, certainly. I'm even just like thinking of these multi-party Western liberal democracies in the first place, right? I mean, let's use the US, for example. There's two parties, Republican, Democrat, and it's like on one hand, you have perhaps the Democrats who people don't necessarily aren't happy with what they've done the past few years or whatever under Biden's term or previously under Obama's, whatever the case may be. And it's like when those parties try to do something that is, I guess, at least perceived to be good for the public, is that a claim to legitimacy? Like, you're right, it isn't applied in the exact same way.
Those political scientists believe that if you have multi-party democracy in elections, what they call free elections, that is where legitimacy is is generated. It's generated at the election. And so when they come to somewhere like Laos, they're like, oh, you don't have real elections, which is crap, by the way. They do have elections. But they say, you don't have real elections. Therefore, it's a really interesting question for us how you generate legitimacy. But it's a completely generated research question that is based on false presumptions about what democracy has to look like.
So that ends it for this episode. We kind of did a very quick run through some of the different topics that Holly touches on in her new Substack, Revolutions and Reproduction. Of course, I'll be linked in the show notes. Holly, it's been great to have you back again. If you haven't already listened to those previous episodes we did, please go back and listen to them, whether that's for the first time or again. Any parting words you have for listeners on your Substack, on Lao, whatever it may be that you'd like to impart with us before we end this episode.
So my Substack, I'm writing a book in slow motion. And so my idea was that I would send out these posts and then people would read them and comment on them and write to me, and I'll get this sort of interactive way of writing. So I really invite people to not only read the Substack, that would be great, but like if you have any comments or advice or, suggestions for further reading or stuff that you really think I should know about, or you just want to ask a question, please feel free to make it a really interactive space, because that's what it's there for.
Oh, that's awesome. I should be doing that. I've read all of it. I haven't been commenting. I'm going to do that, Holly. I promise.
Okay, yeah. I understand people are busy, and sometimes people take a while to take it in, because they're quite long form. Yeah. Maybe I notice people take 2 or 3 weeks and then they'll write me an email after they've thought about it. So, yeah.
Excellent. Thanks, Holly.
Thank you.